Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, a Chinese spy station less than 100 miles away from the U.S. in Cuba. And that's not all. China is reportedly planning to expand this base into a military training facility. IRS whistleblowers tell Congress that their investigation in the Hunter Biden case has been held up and roadblocked. We're going to hear what they had to say in their own words. How the left has been slowly but relentlessly transforming the U.S. for decades. Author Christopher Rufo explains what's been happening in America's cultural revolution. And a global monument to answered prayer, now being built in the United Kingdom. We're going to bring you the story behind this remarkable project. Those stories and the Israeli president's address to Congress today on NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin with a Chinese spy station less than 100 miles off the coast of the United States in Cuba. And this base is expected to be developed into a military training facility. Dale Hurd brings us this look at China's growing power and influence in Cuba and throughout America's other neighbors as well.
This is the Chinese Signals Intelligence Facility at Bejucal, Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. mainland. It allows China to monitor U.S. military communications throughout the southern United States. When its existence was first reported last month, the Pentagon denied it.
We are not aware of China and Cuba developing any type of spy station.
Later, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby evaded, but admitted the base exists.
We're not going to be able to get into too much detail about our own counterintelligence efforts.
And we now know that the spy station isn't new. A former intelligence official told the Miami Herald it's been there since the 1990s, and the U.S. government has known about it. Now there are reports the Chinese plan to expand the spy base into a military training facility. What form it will take is unclear. But consider this base China built on Mischief Reef in the South China Sea. It includes a landing strip, hangars, and a listening post. Cuba is a much easier place to install a military base. But Dr. Evan Ellis, the Latin American specialist at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, says the site at Bejucal is too close to the United States to be useful in any armed conflict, because it would be easy to destroy.
The closeness of Cuba to the United States means that its value for PLA Navy forces is probably pretty low because, again, that would be very, very vulnerable being that close to the United States.
But this is about more than just a military base. China is helping keep a desperate Cuban government afloat. With Cuba facing its biggest economic and political crisis in decades, China has thrown it a lifeline, giving it millions in cash and restructuring its debt.
Cuba is short fuel, it's short medicine, it's short food. Cuba has been facing an economic crisis, but in the past 2 to 3 years, especially since COVID, that crisis has deepened to unprecedented proportions. And China, who's willing to say, we'll bankroll you as long as we get paid.
This is the playbook China has used throughout Latin America to replace the U.S. as the leading trading partner in the region and make nations dependent upon it. Retired Air Force Brigadier General John Teichert says the U.S. is too disengaged in Latin America, including Cuba.
This is a neighbor of ours, 90 miles or so to the south of Key West, and I think we need to start engaging in a real way economically and diplomatically with them. And I think that would take away some of that enticement that China can swoop in and fill the vacuum that we should have filled long ago.
China in the past was careful not to provoke the United States by basing troops in Latin America. But with the planned base in Cuba, Ellis says that may be changing.
So this is crossing a threshold, and clearly the fact that they've chosen to cross the threshold at a time when tensions are increasing over Taiwan and other issues, indicates that there's a willingness to take risks. They're not as worried as they used to be about provoking the United States.
In October 1962, the installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The U.S. government stood up to the Soviets and the missiles were removed. But with the Biden administration seeking better relations with the Chinese government, there would seem to be little chance the White House will stand up to this. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Here at home, 2 IRS whistleblowers testifying before Congress alleging political interference in their investigation of the president's son, Hunter Biden. Special Agent Joseph Ziegler, a self-identified gay Democrat who's married to a man, and his former investigation supervisor, Gary Shapley, say their findings supported felony charges against Hunter Biden rather than the misdemeanor charges he's set to plead guilty to next week. They say they came forward because after more than a decade of experience, they've never seen an investigation be so held up or roadblocked.
Assigned prosecutors did not appear to follow the normal investigative process, slow-walked the investigation, and put in place unnecessary approvals and roadblocks from effectively and efficiently investigating the case. A number of times we were not able to follow the facts.
At every stage, decisions were made that benefited the subject of this investigation. For example, prosecutors concealed contents of Hunter Biden's laptop from investigators. DOJ slow-walked steps to include interviews, serving document requests, and executing search warrants. Warrants that were ready as early as April of 2020, but were delayed until after the November 2020 election and never pursued.
Democrats largely dismissed the agent's claims, Ranking Member Jamie Raskin calling the fact that Congress is even looking into Hunter Biden's case an example of, quote, interference.
The ongoing case that the majority invites us to interfere with today is actually a striking illustration of the success of the American system of independent prosecutors operating under the rule of law and outside the realm of the kind of political influence my colleagues are trying to exercise today.
Raskin went on to say that the president's son made mistakes and is now prepared to be held accountable for them. But Republicans said Hunter Biden was given preferential treatment and questioned whether the president himself would have been implicated had investigators not been held up in their work by administration officials.
The Department of Justice engaged in a campaign to delay, divulge, and deny that investigation. They delayed investigators for years, leading to the expiration of the statute of limitations for many of the crimes involved. And they denied investigators the ability to authenticate evidence, serve warrants, question witnesses, and bring charges.
The whistleblowers said it's up to Congress to decide who is responsible for the failure to bring the full extent of charges against Hunter Biden. And they stressed that a special counsel should have been and still needs to be appointed for the case. Also in Washington Wednesday, Israel's President Isaac Herzog addressing a joint session of Congress, promising that despite disagreements, the U.S. and Israel will always remain family. Although some progressive Democrats boycotted the speech, Herzog received a standing ovation from both sides of the aisle that lasted several minutes. The address coming as Israel marks its 75th anniversary of statehood. CBN's Hillary Powell brings us the story from Capitol Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the State of Israel.
Claps and cheers for Israel's head of state and an overwhelming show of bipartisan support to affirm America's ironclad friendship with Israel.
To celebrate 75 years of Israeli independence with our greatest partner and friend, the United States of America, my soul is overflowing with pride and joy.
In a tribute to Harry Truman, the first American president to recognize Israel as an independent Jewish democratic state, his grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, was honored as a special guest. The address turned from fanfare to business as Herzog doubled down on preventing the Iranian nuclear program.
Allowing Iran to become a nuclear threshold state, whether by omission or by diplomatic commission, is unacceptable.
He also pointed to ongoing protest in Israel, calling demonstrations a necessary part of a strong democracy. Earlier this week, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby also mentioned democracy while expressing concern over Prime Minister Netanyahu's plans to overhaul the country's judicial system and ongoing settlement construction in the West Bank.
We want to see Israel be as vibrant and as viable democracy as possible.
Hoping for eventual peace with Palestinian neighbors, Herzog highlighted how Israel was founded on faith and tolerance, both cornerstones of democracy. He also strongly condemned anti-Semitism, which got another round of applause.
Vilifying and attacking Jews, whether in Israel, in the United States, or anywhere else in the world, is anti-Semitism.
Hillary Powell, CBN News, Washington.
Coming up, why has America changed so much over the decades, moving more and more toward the left? We're going to hear from author Christopher Rufo about what's behind those changes and what they mean for the U.S. when we come back.
Your news channel, your shows, the stories you care about. Anytime you want, anywhere you want. Download the CBN News app today.
Welcome back to NewsWatch. Like China experienced years ago, a long-term cultural revolution is underway in the United States, and it has slowly crept into our culture and institutions. Appearing on this week's episode of The Global Lane, author Christopher Rufo discusses those changes as he believes it's all part of a methodical plan by the American left to radically transform the USA.
It's part of a multi-decade strategy and plan that was first devised by new left radicals and intellectuals in the late 1960s and early 1970s, who devised a plan that they called the Long March through the existing institutions, meaning that they would enter into businesses, academia, K-12 schools, government agencies, and bring their ideology with them to try to transform the culture of those institutions from within. They had first succeeded in academia, then in schools, now in HR offices, and of course, as we saw in the summer of 2020, all of the so-called DEI departments and institutions around the country. This was not happening by accident, and so when people looked around them in the summer of 2020 and said, wait a minute, all of our institutions are subtly in lockstep behind critical race theory and other ideologies. It's important to know that it didn't happen by accident, but was part of this decades-long process.
And Chris, instead of constitutional justice, people often experience leftist mob justice. Equity is emphasized over equality. And some people on the political right contend even the Pentagon is spending more time defending the rights of transsexuals in the military than defending the country. So how did this diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, how did they become institutionalized in government and business?
Through a couple different avenues. First, the activists from the outside used civil rights law and actually hijacked civil rights law in order to force these kind of training programs into all of the institutions under the argument that these institutions were racist because they had disparate outcomes based on racial groups. And then once they became entrenched, they found problem after problem after problem, or rather, more accurately, they invented problem after problem after problem, to the point where now in many government agencies, they're teaching a style of critical race theory that examines everything under the lens of race and finds that everyone, surprise, surprise, suffers from unconscious bias, white privilege, white fragility, internalized whiteness, and they hold the keys to solving these problems. And it first started in some of the softer institutions, the Department of Education and other more typically left-leaning, but now has really taken over the highest reaches of the military.
In 2020, we of course saw George Floyd protests and defund the police efforts pushed by Black Lives Matter. And the former leaders, the organizers of BLM, admitted they were trained Marxists. So how and why did Minneapolis, Minnesota become the epicenter of the BLM movement when it's not a Marxist city? Less than 20% of the population is black. How did that happen?
Well, I think there are many majority white cities in the United States that are very left-leaning. Certainly Minneapolis counts for that. And then where I am in the Pacific Northwest, cities like Seattle and Portland also saw the most extreme rioting and violence during the protests in the summer of 2020. And these are cities where the ideology has taken hold. And the ideology knows, and the activists and BLM, and activists really dating back to the Black Panther Party in the 1960s, they know that these images of police violence and brutality are the most effective spark for starting large-scale social rioting and protests. And so They take these images that are now supercharged through social media. It started in Minneapolis, but then, of course, it spread to more than 140 cities around the country.
And I'm old enough to remember Angela Davis, who was a communist and member of the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s. So you referred to the Black Panther Party. How have Davis and the Black Panthers influenced public education in this country 55 years later?
Tremendously. In the research for the book, I discovered some really disturbing patterns. And one of these was that I read through all of the old Black Panther Party, Marxist-Leninist, radical literature from the late 1960s. And then I compared it with documents from many school districts around the country that I've been reporting on from 2020, 2021, 2022. And I found that the basic set of ideas from Black Panther ideology had migrated all the way into the kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade curriculum, covered sometimes in some euphemism, but the basic ideology is there, almost completely intact. It really shows the strategy of marching through the institutions, bringing the ideology, and then forcing it onto other people's kids in the classrooms. It should give all Americans pause. How did this happen? How did these ideas go from the radical, violent fringes into your child's kindergarten classroom?
So why this focus on race? Why now?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting inversion where of the instances of explicit racial segregation in public institutions that I document in the book, they're all promoted by very far left-wing racialists who believe, in a sense, a new kind of race essentialism. They believe that people are determined by their racial ancestry and categorization, and that it is better for whites to have separate facilities and DEI training programs than African Americans and other minority groups, so that whites can deconstruct their privilege and that minority groups can grapple with their oppression. It's totally counterproductive. It's totally antithetical to what we should be doing. And I find it just the deepest and kind of most sickening irony that we cannot get to a colorblind society, an equal society, a society of individual rights, because these people are determined to drag us into this really dead-end direction.
Okay. One race, the human race. Let's talk again sometime in the days ahead, Chris. There's much more in your book, America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. Christopher Rufo, thank you for sharing your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Also this week on the global lane in the UK, a Christian attorney is culture canceled for tweeting that pride is sin, and why a popular psychiatrist warns over-the-counter birth control pills may bring about hormonal changes that could turn women gay. You can catch the global lane tonight on the CBN News Channel at 8:30 Eastern, and you can also see it on the CBN News app or on YouTube. Still ahead, a new global monument is being built in the United Kingdom. Its purpose to demonstrate answered prayers. We're going to bring you the story behind this amazing project right after this. Thanks for staying with us. A new global monument dedicated to answered prayer is under construction in the United Kingdom. The Eternal Wall of Answered Prayer will be visible from 6 miles away, and it will be complete with 1 million interactive bricks. As CBN's Brody Carter reports, organizers are asking people to send in their testimonies to contribute to the project.
I never let facts get in the way of truth. I've been presented with so many facts about why this can't happen, and I've believed in the truth that God has asked me to do it.
For 19 years, Richard Gamble has pursued an audacious goal to build a monument to remind the world God still works through answered prayer and healing broken hearts. We talked about how it all started.
I was walking along here, and this flash just popped through my mind of building a wall where every brick represented a story of answered prayer.
Towering over 167 feet tall, the wall, modeled on a giant infinity loop, will rest at Coles Hill in Birmingham. The National Landmark's 1 million bricks will link to answered prayer.
People will be able to come and they'll be able to point their phone at any one of the bricks, even the ones that are miles away, and the phone will light up and it will tell them the story of hope that lies within.
Several times I've been able to share that testimony with other people.
Michelle Heritage witnessed the power of prayer as a single parent after God provided for both her and her child.
And it was really amazing to see how provision came in how the work that I'd lost was actually replaced in a much better way with work that was better paid, that was actually better suited to our lifestyle as a family in a new situation.
Michelle's story is just one example of the answered prayers that will rest in the monument.
The power of this is going to stand for hundreds of years.
After 2 decades of planning, Gamble plans to break ground in 2024. He hopes to be operational in 2026. Now, Gamble's asking for your help by simply sharing your story of answered prayer.
We have this funded. We have planning permission. I've got approval from the Prime Minister's office. The hardest thing is getting Christians to give us 5 minutes of their time to actually share a story of what God's done.
So if you have a story of answered prayer, I would really encourage you, write it down and be ready to share it, because your story of hope can be a stepping stone for the next person's breakthrough.
Richard also hopes this landmark will help break negative perceptions against faith, especially in the UK. There, some surveys show only 31% of adults attend church. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Coming up, the Chosen series about the life and ministry of Jesus, now finding a new audience on broadcast television, and it's been a ratings hit. We're going to have that story for you when we come back. Stay with us.
Download the CBN News app. One place for all of your news. Breaking news alerts. Watch CBN News Channel Live. CBN News, because truth matters. Get the CBN News app today.
The hit series The Chosen is now a ratings hit on broadcast television. Angel Studios premiered its first episode on the CW network Sunday night. And based on the life and ministry of Jesus Christ and his disciples, the show brought in over 500,000 viewers, outpacing other hit summer shows like Riverdale, Nancy Drew, and The Rising. The Chosen will air episodes from the first 3 seasons each Sunday, wrapping up around Christmas time. The faith-based drama also announced it will continue filming its 4th season just days after the Screen Actors Guild initiated a strike, halting Hollywood productions. God doesn't want anyone to perish. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of CBN NewsWatch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com. or talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.